After 10 years of marriage, he thought his wife was infertile and divorced her, but she collapsed, and the doctor said, "Congratulations, you're pregnant." "Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. If this is your very first time here, don't just feel welcome. Feel love truly, deeply, instantly. This is more than a story space. It's a home for hearts that need rest, for souls that want to feel again, and for people like you who matter more than they know. Before anything else, I want to cover you in a prayer, not just words, but love wrapped in light. May peace run through your veins like sunlight through trees. May your soul remember how worthy it is, even when the world forgets to say so. I pray that your tears are answered with healing, your loneliness replaced with warmth, and that joy surprises you in the quietest, most unexpected places. You are not forgotten. You are not too late. You are still rising, and you are endlessly loved. To all my family in the United States, happy Independence Day. Your freedom, your journey, your strength, I honor it all. I wrote this story on July 4th, with love in every line, but I'll be sharing it on July 5th, so please forgive this late little candle of love from me. And please, my family, say a gentle prayer for Binta. She is my quiet rock, my behind-the-scenes angel. And right now, she needs your strength too. Whisper her name in love. She will feel it, I promise. Now I ask this with tenderness. Please don't walk away halfway. This isn't just a video. It's a story filled with heartbeats. Stay, let it speak to your spirit, and when the story ends, rate it out of 10 in the comments. Not for numbers, not for praise, just so I can feel you're near. And if you don't, I'll quietly mind. Because I love you that much. Please like this video, drop a kind word, share it with someone who needs to feel held. Let's remind the world what this family is. Honest, loyal, healing, and full of never-ending love. Let's begin. With all my love, forever and always.
Some people spend their entire lives waiting for a moment that changes everything. David Leffel got his on a Tuesday evening when a woman with amber eyes fell directly into his soul. The storm had materialized from nowhere, one of those violent October tempests that transform Brooklyn's orderly streets into chaos. Rain hammered the pavement with relentless force, and wind howled between buildings like something wild and untamed. David had been walking past Brewer's books on Court Street, his architectural drawings tucked safely inside his leather portfolio, when he heard the crash. The bookstore door exploded outward, caught by a vicious gust, and sent the woman behind it tumbling backward into the storm. Without conscious thought, David lunged forward, his hands catching her waist just as she began to fall. Time fractured. The world went silent except for the sound of her surprised gasp and the thundering of his suddenly awakened heart. She was breathtaking. Her skin glowed like warm honey even in the gray stormlight, and her eyes, God, her eyes, were liquid amber flecked with gold, wide with surprise and something else he couldn't name. Dark curls escaped from beneath her soaked hood, framing a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings. When she looked up at him, David felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves around his heart. "I'm so sorry," she breathed, her voice carrying a musical quality that made him think of jazz clubs and Sunday morning hymns all at once. "The wind just caught me." "Don't apologize for falling from heaven," David said, and immediately wanted to disappear into the sidewalk. Had he actually just used that line? But instead of laughing at his terrible attempt at charm, she smiled. A real smile that started in her eyes and bloomed across her face like sunrise. "That's either the worst pickup line I've ever heard," she said, rain still dripping from her lashes, "or the sweetest thing anyone's said to me in months." "Definitely both," David admitted, realizing he was still holding her, that she was still letting him. Neither of them seemed inclined to move. "I'm David." "Nora." Her name fell from her lips like a prayer he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. Nora Franklin. Thunder cracked overhead, and suddenly they were both laughing, at the absurdity of standing in a downpour, at the electricity crackling between them, at the sheer impossibility of this moment. Without discussion, they ran for the bookstore's awning, pressed together under the small shelter, breathing hard and grinning like teenagers. "This is completely insane," Nora said, pushing wet curls from her face. "I don't usually fall into random men on the street." "I don't usually catch falling angels," David replied, then winced. "God, I really need to work on my game." "Don't you dare," she said quickly, her hand touching his arm. The contact sent electricity racing up his spine. "Your game is terrible in the most perfect way." They stood there, strangers pressed together under a narrow awning, and David felt his entire life rearranging itself around this moment. He studied her face, the gentle slope of her nose, the way her bottom lip was slightly fuller than the top, the small scar near her left temple that somehow made her even more captivating. She was studying him too, and he wondered what she saw. Did she notice how his hands trembled slightly? Could she hear his heart hammering against his ribs? "What were you doing in there?" he asked, nodding toward the bookstore, desperate to keep her talking, to stretch this impossible moment into something lasting. "Research," Nora said, her eyes lighting up. "I'm a kindergarten teacher, and I was looking for this specific book about a mouse who builds houses. My kids are fascinated by construction lately. They keep building these elaborate block cities and insisting I tell them if they're structurally sound." She laughed, shaking her head. "Sorry, you probably don't care about 5-year-olds and their architectural obsessions." "Are you kidding?" David's portfolio slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, landing with a splash in a puddle. "I'm an architect. I design buildings for a living. This is impossible." They stared at each other as the implications sank in. Of all the people in all the bookstores in all of Brooklyn, she had to fall into the arms of the one man who would understand her children's fascination with construction. The universe was either playing an elaborate joke or finally paying attention. "What kind of buildings?" Nora asked, and David could hear genuine curiosity in her voice, not the polite interest most people showed when they learned his profession. "All kinds, mostly residential right now, some commercial. I just finished designing a community center in Red Hook." He bent to retrieve his soggy portfolio, then hesitated, looking up at her with something that felt dangerously like hope. "Would you like to see? I mean, not here in the rain, but—" He gestured helplessly at the storm still raging around them. "Are you asking me out?" Nora asked, and there was something playful in her voice that made David's heart skip. "I'm asking if you'd like to see some drawings that might help you convince your kindergartners that their block cities could actually stand up in real life." "That," Nora said, "is either the most practical pickup line ever, or you're genuinely the sweetest man alive." "Can't it be both?" Her laugh was pure music, the kind of sound that made strangers on the street turn around and smile for no reason they could name. "Yes," she said simply, "it can definitely be both." They made another mad dash through the rain, David's jacket spread over both their heads, running and laughing like they'd known each other forever. The coffee shop was exactly as David had described, cramped and dimly lit, with mismatched chairs and tables that wobbled. But it was warm and dry, and when they settled into a corner booth, David spread his drawings across the scarred wooden surface like he was unveiling treasures. "This is incredible," Nora breathed, her fingers tracing the clean lines of his design. "Look at these details. The way the children's area flows into the main space. How natural light comes in here." She looked up at him with wonder. "You really see spaces as living things, don't you?" David felt something crack open inside his chest. No one had ever understood his work that way before. Most people saw blueprints and measurements. Nora saw the soul of the spaces he created. "Tell me about your kids," he said, leaning forward. "The ones obsessed with construction." For the next hour, Nora painted pictures with words, stories of 5-year-old engineers who built block cities and 6-year-old dreamers who wanted to design houses for unicorns. She spoke with her whole body, hands gesturing, eyes dancing, completely animated by her love for her students. David found himself falling deeper with every word, captivated not just by her beauty but by her passion, her joy, the way she saw magic in ordinary moments. "I'm talking too much," Nora said suddenly, flushing. "You must think I'm crazy." "I think you're perfect," David said, and meant it completely. The words hung between them, honest and raw and terrifying in their simplicity. Nora's breath caught. "David, I know this is insane," he continued, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know we just met. I know this doesn't happen in real life. But I have never felt anything like what I'm feeling right now, and I need you to know that." She was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face. Then, so softly he almost missed it. "I feel it too." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small corner of the world, something beautiful was beginning. David reached across the table and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of pieces, finally finding where they belonged. "Can I see you again?" he asked, thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Tomorrow," Nora suggested, then blushed at her eagerness. "Tonight," David countered. "After the storm passes. We could walk, talk more. I'm not ready for this to end." Nora smiled, that radiant expression that had stopped his world the moment he first saw it. "Neither am I." And so began the greatest love story David Leffel had ever known, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. Chapter 2, Paradise Found. Love, David discovered, was not the gentle flutter poets described. It was a wildfire that consumed everything in its path and left you grateful for the burning. 3 months after that storm-soaked evening at Brewer's Books, David woke every morning with the same thought. This cannot be real. Yet there was Nora sleeping peacefully beside him, her dark curls spread across his pillow like spilled silk, morning light painting golden highlights across her skin. Even in sleep, she smiled slightly, as if her dreams were as beautiful as the waking world they'd created together. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of magical moments. David had never believed in fairy tales until Nora taught him that magic existed in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before a kiss, in the way two souls could recognize each other across a crowded room. They spent their first official date walking through Prospect Park for 7 straight hours, talking about everything and nothing, her childhood in North Carolina, his struggles with his demanding family, their shared love of old movies and terrible puns. When it started raining again, because of course it did, they'd taken shelter in the Brooklyn Museum, wandering through exhibits while dripping on the marble floors and making up elaborate stories about the people in paintings. "That woman there," Nora had whispered, pointing to a portrait of a stern-faced Victorian lady. "She's thinking about the love letters hidden in her jewelry box." "And he," David had responded, indicating a gentleman in another frame, "is the one who wrote them. Look at his eyes. He's dying to tell the world, but knows he must keep their secret." They'd created an entire star-crossed romance between two people who had never met, never even lived in the same century, and somehow it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. This was what love was supposed to be: easy, joyful, like coming home to a place you'd never been but had always belonged. Their second date lasted an entire weekend. David had planned a simple dinner, but when he picked Nora up from her apartment, a cozy one-bedroom in Park Slope filled with children's artwork and flowering plants, she'd answered the door in a sundress that made his mouth go dry and said, "I have a confession. I made us a picnic." It's December, David had pointed out, though he was already falling in love with her impracticality. Indoor picnic, she'd grinned, producing a wicker basket. My apartment has excellent floor space. They'd spread blankets across her living room floor, eaten sandwiches by candlelight, and talked until sunrise. Then they'd made breakfast together, Nora humming while she flipped pancakes, David watching her move through her kitchen like she was dancing. When she'd caught him staring, she'd simply taken his hand and pulled him into an impromptu waltz around her tiny dining room table. "I love you," David had said, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. Nora had gone completely still, pancake batter dripping from the spatula in her hand. For one terrible moment, David thought he'd ruined everything. Then her face had transformed into pure radiance. "Thank God," she'd whispered. "I've been dying to say it first." They'd made love for the first time that morning, slow and sweet and desperate all at once. David had worshipped every inch of her body like a man given access to something sacred, marveling at the way she arched beneath his touch, the soft sounds she made when he found exactly the right spot. Afterward, they'd lain tangled together, sharing secrets and dreams and promises that felt as binding as wedding vows. "I want to design houses for you," David had murmured against her shoulder. "Beautiful spaces where you can teach children about magic, and I can watch you make the world better, one small person at a time." "I want to fill them with laughter," Nora had replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "And flowers in every room, and books stacked so high we need ladders, and maybe—" She'd hesitated, suddenly shy. "Maybe what?" "Maybe little feet running through them someday, children with your eyes and my stubbornness." David had kissed her then, deep and certain, sealing the promise between them. Now, 6 months later, he was preparing to make those dreams official. The ring hidden in his sock drawer had cost him 3 months' salary, but he would have mortgaged his soul for the perfect diamond to match the light in Nora's eyes. He'd already picked the spot, the community garden behind her building, where she went every morning to tend the small plot of vegetables she'd somehow convinced the building manager to let her plant. It was where she was happiest, her hands in soil, humming while she worked, completely in her element. "David." Nora's sleepy voice pulled him from his planning. She was stretching like a cat, the sheet slipping down to reveal the smooth curve of her back. "You're thinking so loud you woke me up." "Sorry," he said, pressing a kiss to her bare shoulder. "Go back to sleep. It's early." Can't now. You've got that look." "What look?" "The same one you get when you're designing something important." She rolled over to face him, amber eyes alert despite the early hour. "What are you building in that beautiful brain of yours?" "Our future," David thought, but instead said, "Nothing important. Just thinking about the Henderson project." Nora's expression shifted, and David realized his mistake immediately. She could read him like one of her children's picture books, every emotion written clearly across his face. "Since when do you think about work when you're holding me?" she asked softly. David felt heat creep up his neck. He'd always been a terrible liar, especially with Nora. Her ability to see straight through him was one of the things he loved most about her, and also the most terrifying. "Okay," he said, rolling onto his back with a sigh. "I was thinking about us. Good thoughts or scary thoughts?" "The best thoughts." He pulled her against his side, loving the way she fit perfectly in the curve of his arm. "Thoughts about forever, about making this official, about—" "David Leffel," Nora interrupted, propping herself up on her elbow to stare down at him with wide eyes. "Are you thinking about proposing to me?" The question hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and terrifying and completely inescapable. David met her gaze steadily, seeing his entire future reflected in her amber eyes. "Every day for the past month," he admitted. "From the moment I wake up until the moment I fall asleep, and probably in my dreams too. I'm completely, hopelessly, embarrassingly in love with you, Nora Franklin, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she was smiling so brightly David could have sworn the sun had come up early just to compete. "I was going to do it properly," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "In the garden, with flowers and a speech I've been practicing for weeks. But lying here with you, looking at me like that, I can't wait another second." He reached for the nightstand drawer, but Nora caught his hand. "David, wait." His heart stopped. "Wait, I need to tell you something first." Her voice was soft but steady, and David felt the world tilt sideways. "I've been thinking about this too. About us, about forever. And I need you to know, really know, what you're signing up for. Nora, let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "I come with complications. My students aren't just my job, they're my heart. I bring their problems home. I spend my own money on supplies. I cry when they cry and celebrate their smallest victories like their Olympic medals. I'm not elegant or sophisticated like the women your family probably imagined you'd marry. I plant vegetables in inappropriate places, and I sing to myself when I cook, and I still sleep with a stuffed elephant my grandmother gave me when I was 7. David felt his heart expand until he thought it might burst from his chest. This woman, this incredible, perfect, ridiculous woman, thought these things were flaws instead of all the reasons he'd fallen so completely in love with her. "Are you done?" he asked gently. Nora nodded, looking suddenly vulnerable. "Good, because now it's my turn." David shifted until they were facing each other, his hands cradling her face. "I love your students because they're part of you. I love that you see magic where other people see problems. I love your vegetables and your singing and your stuffed elephant. And I especially love that you think my family's opinion matters more than the fact that you're the best person I've ever known. David, marry me, Nora. Marry me and let me love you badly for the rest of our lives. Let me build you houses full of laughter and books and little running feet. Let me be the man who gets to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep grateful every night." This time, when he reached for the drawer, she didn't stop him. The ring was perfect, a simple solitaire that caught the morning light and threw rainbows across their ceiling. But David barely noticed it, too focused on Nora's face as she whispered, "Yes, yes, of course, yes," and pulled him down for a kiss that tasted like promises and forever and coming home. Chapter 3. Shadows in Paradise. Paradise, Nora learned on a humid Thursday morning in July, could break your heart in the most unexpected ways. She stared at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands, another single pink line staring back at her from the small plastic window. The third negative test this month, the 15th this year, the countless number since she and David had started trying. She'd stopped counting somewhere around the 20th, when hope had begun to feel more like self-torture than possibility. From the kitchen she could hear David humming their wedding song while making coffee, the same tune he'd hummed as they danced barefoot in her grandmother's garden 2 years ago. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the honeysuckle that had perfumed the air, feel the soft grass beneath their feet, hear the laughter of their friends and family celebrating their love story. Their wedding had been everything they dreamed, intimate, joyful, perfect in its imperfection. David had cried during his vows, voice breaking when he'd promised to love her, through every season, every storm, every blessing, and every heartbreak. Nora had worn her grandmother's pearls and a dress she'd found at a vintage shop in the village, something flowing and romantic that made David look at her like she'd descended from heaven, specifically for him. "I can't believe you're mine," he'd whispered during their first dance, spinning her slowly while fireflies created their own constellation overhead. "Believe it," she'd whispered back, standing on tiptoe to kiss him while their guests cheered and camera flashes sparkled like stars. The honeymoon in Tuscany had been pure magic. 2 weeks of getting lost in medieval villages, making love in sun-drenched vineyards, and planning their future while sharing bottles of wine that tasted like liquid gold. They'd decided on children immediately. David wanted 4. Nora insisted 3 was more reasonable, and they'd settled on however many the universe gives us, with the confident assumption that the universe would be generous. Now, 3 years later, Nora was beginning to suspect the universe had other plans. "Coffee's ready, beautiful," David called from the kitchen, and Nora quickly wrapped the test in tissue and buried it deep in the bathroom trash. She couldn't bear to see his face fall again, couldn't watch hope die in his eyes one more time. Instead, she plastered on a smile and joined him in the kitchen of their perfect brownstone apartment, the one he'd spent 6 months renovating specifically for their future family. "Morning, husband," she said, accepting the mug he offered and pressing a kiss to his cheek. He smelled like soap and coffee and something indefinably David that made her feel safe even when her world was tilting sideways. "Sleep well?" David asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stood at the window overlooking their small garden. Another of his projects, he transformed the neglected backyard into a miniature paradise with raised beds for vegetables, a trellis heavy with climbing roses, and a small patio where they spent summer evenings reading to each other by candlelight. "Like a baby," Nora lied, leaning into his warmth. She'd actually spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, calculating ovulation windows and wondering if this month's failure meant there was something seriously wrong with her. "Good," David murmured against her neck, his lips finding that sensitive spot that always made her shiver. "Because I have a surprise for you." "Oh? Close your eyes." Nora obeyed, letting David guide her through the apartment and up the stairs. She could hear him opening a door, the door to what was supposed to be the nursery, but had remained stubbornly empty all these months. "Okay," David said softly. "Open them." Nora's breath caught. The room had been transformed overnight. Gone were the neutral beige walls and empty spaces. Instead, David had painted a mural that took up an entire wall. A whimsical forest scene with dancing animals, flowering trees, and a rainbow that seemed to stretch into infinity. A rocking chair sat by the window, handcrafted from cherry wood and cushioned in soft yellow fabric. Children's books filled a small bookshelf, and in the corner stood a crib that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. "David," she whispered, her heart cracking open. How did you?" "I've been working on it for weeks," he said, his voice soft with pride and hope. "Every morning after you left for school, every weekend when you went shopping with your sister. I wanted it to be perfect when—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "Do you like it?" "Like it?" Nora wanted to collapse right there on the beautiful hardwood floor David had refinished with his own hands. The room was perfect, every detail chosen with love, every element designed to welcome the child they so desperately wanted. It was also the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever seen. "It's beautiful," she managed, and it was. "Absolutely beautiful." David beamed, pulling her into his arms. "I kept thinking about what you said on our honeymoon, about wanting our children to grow up surrounded by art and beauty and love. I want them to know from the moment they're born that they're the most wanted people in the world." Nora buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent while fighting back tears. How could she tell him that this perfect room felt like a shrine to their failure? How could she explain that every beautiful detail was a reminder of what they couldn't seem to create? "Thank you," she whispered instead. "It's perfect. Our baby is going to love it." "When we have a baby," she thought, but didn't say. "If we have a baby." That afternoon, while David was at a client meeting, Nora found herself standing in the doorway of the nursery, staring at the empty crib and trying to imagine a small body sleeping peacefully inside it. She'd done this countless times over the past year, creating elaborate fantasies about midnight feedings and diaper changes and the moment she'd first hold their child. The daydreams were becoming harder to maintain. Her phone rang, startling her from her reverie. "Hello?" "Nora, thank God you answered. I need your advice about the most ridiculous thing." Her sister Keisha's voice filled the apartment, bright and familiar and wonderfully distracting. For the next hour, Nora lost herself in Keisha's latest romantic drama, grateful for the temporary reprieve from her own thoughts. But when the call ended and silence filled the apartment again, the weight of the empty nursery pressed down on her like a physical thing. She found herself in their bedroom, pulling out the journal she'd started keeping when they first began trying. Page after page of carefully tracked cycles, temperature charts, and increasingly desperate notes about timing and positions and supplements that were supposed to help. The early entries were filled with excitement and confidence. The recent ones read like the diary of someone slowly losing hope. "Month 18, she wrote, her handwriting shaky. "Another negative test. David finished the nursery today. It's beautiful and I can't stop crying. What if we never fill it? What if I'm broken in some way that can't be fixed? What if David realizes he married the wrong person?" "Nora," David's voice drifted up from downstairs. "I'm home." "Where's my gorgeous wife?" "Coming," she called back, quickly closing the journal and shoving it back into her dresser drawer. She checked her reflection in the mirror, wiping away any trace of tears before heading downstairs to greet the man who'd built her a perfect room for the child she was beginning to fear they'd never have. David was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and tie loosened, looking like every fantasy she'd ever had about coming home to someone who loved her completely. "How was your meeting?" she asked, accepting his kiss and trying to focus on the warmth of his lips instead of the ache in her chest. "Good. Great, actually. The Hendersons want me to design their summer house in the Hamptons." His eyes were bright with excitement. "It's a huge project, Nora. The kind of thing that could really establish my reputation." "That's wonderful," Nora said, and meant it. David's career was flourishing, his designs gaining recognition throughout the city. At least one of them was successful at creating something beautiful. "There's more," David continued, his hands settling on her waist. "The timeline is flexible, which means I could potentially work from home more often, be here when—" He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the perfect nursery waiting upstairs. "When?" Nora repeated softly. "When?" David confirmed, his voice firm with certainty she wished she could share. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "I know it's taking longer than we expected, love, but we're going to have this. Our family, our children, our happily ever after. I believe that with everything I am." Looking into his gray eyes, seeing the absolute faith reflected there, Nora almost believed it too. Almost. But doubt had taken root in her heart, growing stronger with each passing month, each negative test, each perfectly prepared nursery that remained empty. "I love you," she whispered, because it was the truest thing she knew. "I love you too," David replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted like hope and heartbreak, and the stubborn determination to keep trying. Outside, evening shadows stretched across their garden, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear children playing, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze like a melody she couldn't quite reach. Chapter 4. When Families Become Poison. The first crack in their paradise came disguised as a Sunday dinner invitation from David's mother, and like most destructive things, it appeared harmless on the surface. "Mom wants us to come for dinner next weekend," David said, looking up from his phone with that particular expression he got whenever his family made contact, love and obligation warring with something that looked suspiciously like dread. "The whole family will be there. James is bringing Sophia." Nora's stomach clenched at the mention of David's sister-in-law. Sophia Leffel was 3 months pregnant with what would be the first Leffel grandchild, a fact that Evelyn mentioned with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. Ever since the announcement 2 months ago, family gatherings had become minefields of pointed comments and meaningful looks that left Nora feeling like a failure before she'd even finished her appetizer. "Of course," Nora said, forcing a smile. "It'll be nice to see everyone." It was a lie, and they both knew it. David's family had never quite warmed to her, though they'd been polite enough during the engagement and wedding. She was different from what they'd expected. Too ethnic, too working class, too passionate about causes they deemed unimportant. But she was also clearly devoted to David, and he was clearly happy, so they'd maintained a careful civility that felt more like a ceasefire than acceptance. The pregnancy situation had changed everything. Sunday arrived gray and drizzling, matching Nora's mood as she stood in front of her closet, trying to choose an outfit that would somehow make her feel armor-plated against whatever subtle cruelties awaited. She finally settled on a navy dress David had always loved, hoping that looking beautiful for him might provide some protection against his family's increasingly pointed observations about her apparent inability to provide them with grandchildren. The Leffel family home in Westchester was everything Nora had expected when she'd first visited, imposing, immaculate, and slightly cold, despite its obvious expense. Evelyn Leffel answered the door herself, perfectly coiffed and radiating the kind of effortless elegance that made Nora feel overdressed and underprepared simultaneously. "David, darling," Evelyn said, embracing her son with genuine warmth before turning to Nora with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Nora, how lovely. Come in, everyone's in the living room." The everyone turned out to be an intimate gathering of David's immediate family, plus Connor Walsh, David's best friend from college who'd recently divorced his wife and seemed to be going through what Nora privately termed his bitter bachelor phase. James and Sophia were seated prominently on the main sofa, Sophia's small but visible bump displayed like a trophy, while she regaled the room with detailed accounts of morning sickness and prenatal vitamins. "Nora," Sophia exclaimed with the kind of effusive enthusiasm that always made Nora suspicious. "You look wonderful. Doesn't she look wonderful, James?" James Leffel looked up from his conversation with Connor and offered a smile that was marginally warmer than his mother's. "Absolutely. Marriage agrees with you both." What Nora didn't know, what David himself barely understood, was that his family's cruelty came from a place of genuine fear. Evelyn Leffel had built her entire identity around the perfect family she'd created. The successful sons who'd married the right women and produced the next generation of Leffels. When David married Nora, it had disrupted the careful narrative she'd constructed about her family's superiority. And now, with Nora's apparent inability to conceive, that disruption felt like a personal failing on Evelyn's part. "Speaking of which," Evelyn said, settling into her chair with the air of someone about to deliver important news, "Mrs. Patterson from down the street was asking about you two just yesterday. Apparently her daughter-in-law just found out she's expecting twins. On their first try, can you imagine? She was wondering if you might have any exciting news to share soon." The words hit Nora like physical blows. She felt David's hand tighten around hers, but before he could respond, Connor jumped into the conversation with the tactlessness that had made him such a hit at college parties and such a disaster at family dinners. "Maybe they're being smart about it," he said, swirling his scotch. "Kids change everything, you know? Look at my situation. Thank God Sarah and I never had any. Made the divorce so much cleaner." "Oh, but that's completely different," Sophia said, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "When you're truly meant to be parents, children are a blessing, not a burden. James and I couldn't wait to start our family. Some people just have that natural maternal instinct, you know?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. Nora felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something dangerously close to shame. Were they suggesting that she lacked maternal instinct? That her inability to conceive was somehow evidence of her unsuitability as a mother? "Children come when they're meant to," David said firmly, his architect's voice steady and controlled. "Nora and I are perfectly happy as we are." "Of course you are, darling," Evelyn said with the kind of patronizing tone usually reserved for small children. "But you're not getting any younger, and fertility issues become more common as women age. Perhaps it would be wise to see a specialist. I know an excellent doctor." "Mom," David warned, but Evelyn continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Dr. Harrison has worked miracles with several of my friends' daughters. Of course, in some cases, the problems are insurmountable, but there are other options: adoption, surrogacy." She paused delicately. "Though I understand those can be complicated when there are cultural considerations." The euphemism hit Nora like a slap. Cultural considerations, as if her being black somehow complicated their theoretical future children's place in the pristine Leffel family tree. What Evelyn didn't say, what she barely admitted to herself, was that she'd spent sleepless nights worrying about what mixed-race grandchildren would mean for her carefully curated social circle. Would they fit into the private schools? Would they be accepted at the country club? These weren't questions she was proud of having, but they gnawed at her nonetheless, making her desperate for David to find someone who would produce the uncomplicated grandchildren she'd always envisioned. "I think we should change the subject," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm just being practical, David," Evelyn replied, her tone suggesting he was being unreasonably sensitive. "Marriage is about more than romance. It's about building a legacy, continuing the family line. If Nora can't—" "Stop." David's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Just stop." But the damage was done. The words hung in the elegant living room like toxic gas, poisoning the air between them. If Nora can't. As if her ability to conceive was the sole measure of her worth as a wife, as a woman, as a member of their family. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversation and careful politeness. Sophia dominated the discussion with pregnancy talk, while Evelyn offered unwanted advice about everything from nursery decorating to childbirth classes. Connor made increasingly inappropriate comments about the benefits of remaining childless, while James nodded along with the smug satisfaction of someone whose wife had already proven her fertility. Through it all, David sat beside Nora, his hand never leaving hers, offering small gestures of support and solidarity. But she could feel something shifting in him, some subtle change in the way he held himself, the way his eyes lingered on Sophia's bump, the way he seemed to be calculating something behind his carefully maintained facade. The drive home was silent except for the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers fighting the persistent drizzle. Nora stared out the passenger window, watching the suburbs give way to the city, and tried to process what had just happened. It wasn't the first time David's family had made her feel unwelcome, but it was the first time their disapproval had centered so explicitly on her apparent failure as a wife. "I'm sorry," David said finally as they pulled into their driveway. "They were completely out of line." "Were they?" Nora asked quietly. "Or were they just saying what everyone's thinking?" "Nora, it's been 3 years, David. 3 years of trying, of hoping, of pretending that this is normal. Maybe they're right, maybe there is something wrong with me." David turned off the engine and twisted in his seat to face her. "There is nothing wrong with you, nothing. Do you hear me?" "Then why?" The question came out as a whisper, raw with months of accumulated pain. "Why isn't this working? Why can't I give you what every other woman seems to manage without even trying?" "Because sometimes life is unfair," David said, reaching for her hand. "Because sometimes the things we want most take longer than we expect. But that doesn't mean we give up. That doesn't mean my family gets to make you feel like less than the incredible woman you are." Nora wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to his certainty, his unwavering faith in their future together. But Evelyn's words echoed in her mind. If Nora can't, as if her inability to conceive was a personal failing, a flaw that made her unworthy of the Leffel name. "What if I can't?" she asked, the question scraping her throat raw. "What if we try for another year, another 5 years, and nothing happens? What then?" David was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Then we'll figure out another way. Adoption, fertility treatments, whatever it takes. Or maybe we'll decide that being just us is enough. But we'll decide together, Nora. Not because my mother thinks she knows what's best for our marriage." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promises. And for a moment, Nora let herself believe that love really could conquer everything. Even biology, even his family's disapproval, even the growing fear that she was fundamentally broken in some irreparable way. But as they walked into their house, past the empty nursery that had become a monument to their struggle, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreversibly that evening. David's family had planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the fertile soil of their shared disappointment, and no amount of love letters or morning kisses could change the fact that with each passing month, each negative test, each pointed comment from his family, the foundation of their marriage was developing cracks that might eventually bring the whole structure crashing down. Chapter 5. The End of Everything Beautiful. The morning David stopped reaching for Nora in his sleep was the morning their marriage began to die, though neither of them realized it at the time. It happened gradually, like erosion, so slowly that by the time you noticed the damage, the foundation had already been irreparably weakened. 7 years of failed attempts, of hope rising and crashing with each lunar cycle, of David's family's increasingly pointed suggestions that maybe he deserved someone who could give him everything he wanted. The words had taken root in soil already made fertile by disappointment, growing into something dark and suffocating that strangled the love that had once flourished there. Nora noticed the change in small ways first. David no longer left love notes in her lunchbox. He stopped humming their wedding song while making coffee. When she reached for him in the middle of the night, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth of his body, she found empty space where his arms used to welcome her without hesitation. "We need to talk about options," David said one evening in late October of their 8th year of marriage, his voice carefully neutral as he stood in the doorway of what was still optimistically called the nursery. The room had become a museum of their failure, the hand-painted mural now seeming like mockery, the empty crib a constant reminder of what they couldn't create together. Nora looked up from the baby blanket she'd been knitting for the past 3 years, a project she worked on whenever the emptiness became too overwhelming to bear. What kind of options? Practical ones. David sat heavily in the rocking chair he'd built with such hope, but he didn't rock. He never rocked anymore. "My mother mentioned Dr. Harrison again yesterday. She thinks—" "Your mother thinks a lot of things," Nora interrupted, her needles clicking with more force than necessary. "Most of them involve finding reasons why I'm inadequate for her precious son." "That's not fair, Nora." "Isn't it?" She set down her knitting and really looked at him for the first time in weeks. When had those lines appeared around his eyes? When had his shoulders begun to carry themselves like they were bearing an invisible weight? When's the last time you defended me to your family, David? When's the last time you told your mother that her suggestions are none of her business? David's silence was answer enough. The truth was, Evelyn Leffel had become a master of warfare disguised as concern. Sunday dinners had become exercises in psychological torture, with Sophia's ever-expanding belly serving as a visual reminder of everything Nora couldn't provide. Last week, Evelyn had casually mentioned that Connor's new girlfriend was such a lovely girl and so young and healthy-looking. The implication had been crystal clear. David could still start over with someone whose body wouldn't fail him. Maybe she has a point, David said quietly, and Nora felt something crucial break inside her chest. About what, exactly? About exploring other possibilities. There are women who might be able to... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Nora heard it anyway. There are women who might be able to give me what you can't. Other women, Nora repeated, her voice dangerously calm. You're talking about other women. No. David stood so quickly the chair rocked violently behind him. That's not what I meant. I'm talking about surrogacy or adoption or finding someone else who can actually do what wives are supposed to do. The words hung between them like smoke from a house fire, acrid and choking. David's face went white, then red, then something that looked almost like relief, as if she'd finally said what he'd been thinking but hadn't had the courage to voice. Maybe, he said softly, and the single word destroyed everything they'd built together. Nora stood on shaking legs, her knitting falling to the floor in a tangle of yellow yarn. Maybe what, David? Maybe you married the wrong woman? Maybe you'd be happier with someone like Sophia, someone whose body actually works the way it's supposed to. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained steady. I can see it in your eyes every time I disappoint you. Every negative test, every failed cycle, every family dinner where your mother makes another helpful suggestion about my obvious inadequacies. Nora, please, when did you stop fighting for us? The question came out as a whisper, broken and raw. When did you stop believing that we were enough, just as we are? David looked at her for a long moment, and Nora saw the exact instant when he realized he couldn't answer that question. When he realized that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing her as the woman he'd fallen in love with, and started seeing her as the woman who couldn't give him children. I think, he said carefully, maybe we both deserve the chance to be happy. I am happy, Nora said desperately. Or I was, when you still loved me more than you loved the idea of having children. It's not about children anymore, Nora. It's about us, about how we've both become people we don't recognize, trapped in this cycle of disappointment and blame and... I never blamed you, Nora interrupted. Not once, David. Not ever. No, he agreed, and his voice was infinitely sad. You blamed yourself. And watching you break a little more each month, watching you disappear into your own guilt and shame. I can't do it anymore, Nora. I can't watch you destroy yourself over something that might never happen. So your solution is to destroy us instead? David closed his eyes as if her words physically hurt him. Maybe we're already destroyed. Maybe we've been so focused on creating life that we forgot how to live. The conversation continued for hours, cycling through anger and tears and desperate attempts to find some way back to who they used to be. But the damage was too extensive, the foundation too weakened by years of accumulated disappointment and his family's toxic influence. By dawn, David was sleeping in the guest room, and by the end of the week, he'd found an apartment in Manhattan. I love you, he said on the day he came to collect his things, standing in their kitchen, their beautiful kitchen where they'd danced on their second date, where he'd proposed with a twist tie ring, where they'd shared 1,000 morning kisses and dreamed of feeding babies in high chairs. I need you to know that this isn't about not loving you. Then what is it about? Nora asked, though she was too exhausted to really care about the answer. It's about accepting that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes two people can love each other completely and still not be able to build a life together. He kissed her forehead then, gentle and final, and Nora closed her eyes and pretended she was 25 again, standing in a bookstore doorway, falling into the arms of a man who thought she'd fallen from heaven specifically for him. "I'm sorry," David whispered against her hair. "I'm so sorry for all of it." "Me too," she whispered back, and meant it. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later, drawn up by a lawyer David's family had recommended, with terms that were generous to the point of guilt. The brownstone, the savings account, even the furniture they'd chosen together, all hers, as if material possessions could somehow compensate for the loss of everything that had actually mattered. Nora signed them without reading the details, her signature shaky but determined. 8 years of marriage, of believing in forever, of building a life with someone who'd promised to love her through every season, every storm, every blessing, and every heartbreak. Reduced to a stack of legal documents and the hollow echo of her footsteps in rooms that suddenly felt too big for one person. That night she sat in the rocking chair David had built, surrounded by the mural he'd painted with such hope, and finally let herself grieve for everything they'd lost. Not just the children they'd never had, but the people they'd been before disappointment had turned them into strangers, wearing familiar faces. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the city in pristine white, covering all the ugly scars and making everything look clean and new and possible again. But inside their house, her house now, Nora rocked slowly back and forth and wondered if some kinds of damage were too deep to ever truly heal. Chapter 6. When Miracles Come Too Late. The universe, Nora discovered on a Tuesday morning in October, was either utterly compassionate or unspeakably cruel. She hadn't decided which. She was in the middle of reading Where the Wild Things Are to her kindergarten class when the first wave of nausea hit. For a moment she thought it was just stress. The divorce had been finalized only 6 weeks ago, and her body was still adjusting to the reality of sleeping alone, eating alone, existing in the hollow shell of what had once been their shared life. Miss Franklin, 5-year-old Jaden interrupted, his small hand raised with the serious concern that only children could muster. "Are you okay? You look green like the Hulk, but sad green, not angry green." "Miss Franklin now," Nora corrected gently, though the name still felt foreign on her tongue. After 8 years of being Mrs. David Leffel, reverting to her maiden name felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. "And I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." But she wasn't fine. The nausea rolled through her in waves, accompanied by a bone-deep exhaustion she'd been attributing to heartbreak and the monumental task of rebuilding her life from scratch. When the second wave hit, stronger than the first, she had to grip the edge of her reading chair to keep from swaying. "Miss Rodriguez," she called to her teaching assistant, "could you take over story time? I need to step out for a moment." In the bathroom, Nora splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the fluorescent-lit mirror. She looked terrible, pale, drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too many tears. But there was something else, something that made her press her hands to her flat stomach, with a hope so sharp it felt like physical pain. "No," she told herself firmly. "Don't even think it. You've been down this road too many times." But the thought had taken root, growing with the persistence of weeds in fertile soil. She'd been so consumed with the emotional devastation of her divorce that she hadn't been paying attention to her body's signals. When was her last period? She tried to remember, but the past 2 months were a blur of legal documents and late-night crying sessions and the overwhelming task of learning how to exist without David. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of attempted normalcy. Nora taught math lessons and supervised lunch, mediated playground disputes, and helped tiny hands with shoelaces. All while a voice in the back of her mind whispered impossible possibilities. By the time the final bell rang and the last student was collected by their parent, she was practically vibrating with nervous energy. The pharmacy on Fifth Avenue was anonymous enough that she felt comfortable purchasing a pregnancy test without fear of running into anyone she knew. Still, she wore sunglasses and paid in cash, as if buying hope could somehow be traced back to her if it turned out to be false. At home, in the brownstone that still smelled like David's coffee and the lavender soap he used when shaving, Nora sat on the bathroom floor with the test balanced on her knees, too terrified to look at the results. 3 minutes had never felt so eternal. "Please," she whispered to whatever cosmic force might be listening, "please let this be real. Please let something good come from all this pain." When she finally worked up the courage to look, the plus sign was so clear, so undeniably present, that she actually laughed out loud, a sound somewhere between joy and hysteria that echoed off the bathroom tiles like a prayer answered too late. Pregnant. After 8 years of trying, of failing, of having her marriage crumble under the weight of their collective disappointment, she was finally, miraculously, impossibly pregnant. The irony was so sharp it felt like a blade between her ribs. Their baby, the child she and David had dreamed of, planned for, grieved the absence of, had been conceived during their final, desperate attempts to save their marriage. While they were already talking to lawyers, already sleeping in separate rooms, already giving up on forever, their bodies had finally, secretly, created the life they'd always wanted. Nora clutched the test to her chest and sobbed, for the timing, for the cruel joke of it all, for the fact that the greatest joy of her life was also the most devastating proof that sometimes miracles came too late to save what they'd been meant to heal. Her first instinct was to call David, to share this impossible news with the man who'd wanted it just as desperately as she had. Her phone was in her hand before she remembered that he wasn't hers to call anymore. He'd made his choice, had decided that she was a failure, that their love wasn't worth fighting for, that he deserved someone who could give him everything he wanted. Well, now she could. Now her body had finally done what it was supposed to do, had created the life they'd both dreamed of. But it was too late. David had already given up on them, already decided that she was broken beyond repair, already walked away from their marriage like it was something disposable rather than sacred. He chose to leave, Nora reminded herself, the thought as bitter as medicine. He chose his family's poison over our love. He doesn't get to know about this miracle he was too weak to wait for. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. This baby would be hers alone. She would love it enough for 2 parents, would give it everything David had been too cowardly to provide. She would prove that she didn't need his family's approval or his wavering faith in their future. She would show the world and herself that some women were strong enough to build families on their own. The next few weeks passed in a blur of secret doctor's appointments and carefully hidden morning sickness. Dr. Chen, her longtime gynecologist, was overjoyed at the news but concerned about Nora's emotional state. "This is wonderful, but I have to ask, how are you feeling about becoming a single mother? Do you have support systems in place?" "I'm a teacher," Nora said, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "I've been preparing for motherhood my entire adult life. I can do this alone." "I don't doubt your capabilities, Doctor," Chen said gently, "but raising a child is challenging under the best circumstances. Have you considered telling the father? He might—" "The father made his position clear when he divorced me," Nora interrupted. "This baby and I will be just fine without him." It was a lie and a truth at the same time. She was terrified of doing this alone, of explaining to her child why Daddy wasn't there, of handling midnight feedings and toddler tantrums and teenage rebellions without a partner. But she was also fierce in her determination to prove that she could be enough, that love from one devoted parent was better than disappointment from 2 who'd given up on each other. At 10 weeks, the morning sickness became so severe that she could barely keep water down, let alone teach a classroom full of energetic 5-year-olds. She tried to power through it, sipping ginger tea and nibbling saltines between lessons, but her body had other plans. She was in the middle of explaining addition using counting bears when the world suddenly tilted sideways. The last thing she remembered was Jaden's voice, high and worried. "Miss Franklin is falling down like the blocks in our earthquake game." When she woke up in Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, the first face she saw belonged to Dr. Amelia Chen, who was smiling with the radiant joy of someone delivering the best possible news. "Congratulations, Doctor," Chen said, squeezing Nora's hand. "You're going to be a mother." "I know," Nora whispered, her voice hoarse from dehydration. "I've known for weeks." "Well, now everyone's going to know," Dr. Chen said with a laugh. "Fainting at work tends to prompt questions. The EMTs said your principal is outside, along with half your teaching staff. They're all worried sick about you." Nora closed her eyes, realizing that her secret was about to become very public. Within hours, the news would spread through her school, her neighborhood, her circle of friends, and eventually, inevitably, it would reach David. Let it, she thought with a defiance that surprised her. Let him know what he walked away from. Let him live with the knowledge that he gave up on us just months before his dreams came true. "How far along am I?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "About 12 weeks. You're through the most dangerous period and everything looks beautiful. Strong heartbeat, good growth, no signs of complications." Dr. Chen paused, her expression becoming more serious. "Nora, I have to ask again, are you sure you want to do this alone? The father made his choice," Nora said firmly. "This baby and I will make ours." That night, lying in the hospital bed and staring at the ultrasound photo of her perfectly formed miracle, Nora made a promise to the child growing inside her. She would love them fiercely, protect them completely, and never let them feel the sting of rejection that had shattered her own heart. They would know they were wanted, chosen, treasured, even if their father had been too weak to stick around to meet them. "It's going to be just you and me, little one," she whispered to the grainy image that looked like hope given form. "And I promise you, that's going to be more than enough." Outside her window, the lights of Brooklyn twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the city, David was living his new life, free from the burden of loving a woman whose body had finally, cruelly, done exactly what it was supposed to do. Chapter 7. Learning to Love Again. The first time Malva laughed, really laughed, not just the reflexive smile that melted Nora's heart daily. She was 6 weeks old and staring at the dancing shadows on her nursery wall that David had painted years ago. Nora had been changing her diaper, exhausted from another sleepless night and wondering how something so small could produce such an enormous amount of laundry, when Malva suddenly burst into delighted giggles. The sound was pure magic, like wind chimes made of starlight, and Nora felt her heart crack open with a love so intense it was almost painful. "What's so funny, little star?" Nora whispered, following her daughter's gaze to the mural David had painted with such hope. The dancing animals seemed to move in the afternoon light streaming through the window, and Malva was enchanted, her tiny fists waving as if she was trying to conduct their silent symphony. It was the first time Nora had been able to look at that wall without feeling the sharp stab of loss. Suddenly, the mural wasn't a monument to her failed marriage. It was a gift David had unknowingly given to their daughter, a beautiful world for Malva to discover and explore. "Thank you," Nora thought, and for the first time since their divorce, the thought of David didn't bring pain, just gratitude for this one beautiful thing he'd left behind. Single motherhood was nothing like the blogs and parenting books had described. It was harder, bone-deep exhaustion, the weight of every decision resting solely on her shoulders, the peculiar loneliness that came from having someone to talk to constantly, even if they couldn't talk back, while simultaneously feeling more isolated than ever. But it was also more beautiful than anything she'd imagined. Every milestone belonged entirely to them. Malva's first smile, her first word, which was mama, not dada, and Nora definitely didn't cry about that for a full 10 minutes, her first steps across the living room into Nora's waiting arms. There was no one to argue with about sleep schedules or feeding times, no one whose mother called with unsolicited advice about proper child-rearing techniques. Just Nora and Malva, learning how to be a family of two. "She has your stubbornness," Nora's sister Keisha observed during one of her weekend visits, watching 18-month-old Malva systematically remove every book from the lower shelves and arrange them in precise piles around the living room. "And her father's architectural tendencies, apparently," Nora replied, marveling at the complex patterns her daughter was creating. Even as a toddler, Malva showed an unusual understanding of spatial relationships, building towers that defied physics and arranging her toys with mathematical precision. "You never talk about him," Keisha said carefully. "David, don't you think Malva deserves to know—" "Malva deserves to know she's loved completely," Nora interrupted, her voice firm but not angry. "Which she is. By me, by you, by everyone who matters." It wasn't that Nora never thought about David. Sometimes, lying in bed listening to Malva babble herself to sleep in the next room, she wondered what he was doing, whether he was happy, if he ever thought about what they'd lost. But those moments became fewer and farther between as the months passed, and her life filled with the beautiful chaos of raising a brilliant, creative, impossibly energetic little girl. By the time Malva turned 3, Nora had been promoted to assistant principal at her school. The job came with better pay, more responsibility, and the flexibility to handle the inevitable sick days and parent-teacher conferences that came with single motherhood. Her colleagues had rallied around her from the beginning, creating an unofficial support network that felt more like family than David's actual family ever had. "Mama, why don't I have a daddy?" Malva asked one evening as Nora was reading her bedtime story. She was 4 now, precocious and observant, with David's gray eyes and his way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Nora had been preparing for this question for months, but it still caught her off guard. "You do have a daddy, sweetheart. He just lives far away. Why doesn't he come visit?" "Sometimes grown-ups have to make very hard choices," Nora said carefully, smoothing Malva's dark curls away from her forehead. "Your daddy loved us very much, but he had to go find out who he was supposed to be before he could be the kind of daddy you deserved." It was the story Nora had crafted over the years. Not entirely true, but not entirely false either. David had chosen to leave, had decided that their love wasn't worth fighting for. In Nora's version, his leaving was about his own journey rather than his rejection of them. "Will he come back when he figures it out?" Malva asked with the innocent hope that only children possessed. "I don't know, baby," Nora said honestly. "But what I do know is that you are the most loved little girl in the entire world, daddy or no daddy." Malva seemed satisfied with this answer, snuggling deeper into her blankets with the easy acceptance that was one of her most endearing qualities. But the question lingered in Nora's mind long after her daughter was asleep. Was she doing the right thing, keeping Malva's existence a secret? David had a right to know he had a daughter, didn't he? But then she remembered his face on the day he delivered his ultimatum about her fertility, the way he'd looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, rather than the woman he'd promised to love forever. She thought about his family's cruelty, their barely concealed racism and classism, their poisonous influence on the man she'd loved. No, she decided, Malva deserves better than that. She deserves to know she's wanted, not to be another disappointment in the Leffel family's perfect narrative. As Malva grew older, her questions became more sophisticated, but Nora's answers remained consistent. Her daddy was a good man who had loved them but couldn't stay. He was an architect who built beautiful buildings. He had gray eyes just like hers and a way of seeing the world that was special and unique. "Do I look like him?" Malva asked when she was 6, studying herself in the mirror with the intense focus she brought to everything. "You have his eyes and his way of thinking," Nora said, brushing Malva's hair into neat braids for school. "But you have my heart and my stubbornness and your grandmother's artistic soul." "Am I smart like him?" "You're smart like you," Nora replied firmly. "Your intelligence is your own gift, Malva. Don't ever think you need someone else to make you special." By the time Malva turned 8, Nora had been promoted to principal, becoming the youngest person ever to hold the position at Brookside Elementary. The achievement felt like vindication, proof that she could build a successful life on her own terms, that she didn't need David's family's approval or anyone else's validation to be worthy. "I'm proud of you, Mama," Malva said on the day Nora received the news, her small arms wrapped around Nora's waist in a fierce hug. "You're the best principal in the whole world." "And you're the best daughter in the whole universe," Nora replied, lifting Malva up to spin her around their kitchen. The same kitchen where she and David had danced as newlyweds, where they'd shared dreams and morning coffee and the quiet intimacy of two people building a life together. But that life felt like a different lifetime now. This life, hers and Malva's, was fuller, richer, more authentic than anything she'd had before. She'd learned that love didn't require another adult to validate it, that family could be built from fierce devotion between a mother and child, that strength could grow from the ashes of heartbreak. "Mama," Malva said one evening as they worked together in their garden, the same space David had cultivated with such care, now transformed into Malva's outdoor laboratory, where she conducted elaborate experiments with soil composition and plant growth. "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you ever miss being married?" Nora looked at her daughter, 8 years old now, brilliant and beautiful, and asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things, and realized the answer was more complicated than she'd expected. "I miss some things about it," she said honestly. "I miss having someone to share the good news with, someone to help with the hard decisions. But I don't miss feeling like I wasn't enough, just as I was." "You're enough for me," Malva said simply, and Nora felt tears prick her eyes. "And you're enough for me too, little star. More than enough. You're everything." That night, after Malva was asleep, Nora sat in her daughter's nursery, still decorated with David's hopeful mural, and marveled at the life they'd built together. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the fairy tale she'd believed in when she was young and naive and thought that love conquered everything. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was beautiful in ways she couldn't have imagined when she was desperately trying to fix what was already broken. She'd learned to love again, not romantic love, but something deeper and fiercer. The love between a mother and child, built on daily devotions and shared dreams and the absolute certainty that they were enough for each other, exactly as they were. Chapter 8. Empty Success. The penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park should have been everything David Leffel had ever wanted. But at 3 in the morning, surrounded by awards and accolades and the silence of a life lived entirely for himself, it felt more like an expensive prison. 9 years had passed since he'd walked away from Nora, 9 years of building the career that was supposed to validate his choice, supposed to prove that he'd made the right decision in choosing ambition over love. His firm, Leffel and Associates, was now one of Manhattan's most prestigious architectural practices. His buildings graced magazine covers, and his designs had won every major award in the industry. He was invited to the right parties, dated the right women, lived in the right neighborhood. So why did he feel like he was slowly suffocating? David stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of whiskey growing warm in his hand, and stared out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, 3 miles away in Brooklyn, was the brownstone he'd renovated with such hope and determination. The home he'd designed for the life he'd thrown away when things got difficult. He'd driven past it exactly once, 6 months after their divorce was finalized. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The garden he'd planted still flourishing, the windows still gleaming, the front door still painted the shade of deep blue Nora had chosen because it reminded her of her grandmother's favorite dress. But it felt like looking at a museum exhibit of his former life, beautiful and untouchable, and forever beyond his reach. "You're brooding again," Connor said, emerging from the kitchen with a beer and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just raided David's refrigerator. His college roommate had become a frequent visitor to the penthouse, especially since his latest divorce had been finalized. "It's not attractive, Leffel." "I'm not brooding," David replied automatically. "I'm thinking about her again." It wasn't a question. Connor had an uncanny ability to read David's moods, probably because they'd been friends for 15 years, and Connor had witnessed firsthand the gradual erosion of David's marriage, had even contributed to it with his constant suggestions that David deserved someone who could actually give him what he wanted. The irony wasn't lost on David now. Connor's own marriage had imploded 2 years ago when his wife discovered his affair with a colleague, and his ex-wife had taken him for everything he was worth. Apparently, having children hadn't guaranteed marital bliss any more than not having them had guaranteed failure. "I don't know what you're talking about," David said, but even he could hear the lie in his voice. "Right. That's why you've been impossible to live with for the past month." What triggered it this time? Another wedding invitation? Another baby announcement from someone we went to college with? Actually, it had been a magazine article. Brooklyn's rising stars, educators making a difference. David had been reading Architectural Digest in his dentist's waiting room when he'd turned the page and found himself staring at a photograph that had stopped his heart completely. Nora, standing in front of a school building, surrounded by children who were looking at her with the kind of adoration usually reserved for superheroes. She was older, more confident, radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were meant to do. The article described her as Principal Nora Franklin, whose innovative approach to education has transformed Brookside Elementary into a model for urban schools nationwide. Principal. She'd been promoted, had achieved the kind of success that made his own achievements feel suddenly hollow, but it was her smile that had undone him completely, the same radiant expression that had stopped his world the first time he'd seen it, now directed toward a classroom full of children who clearly worshipped her. She looked happy, really genuinely happy in a way that made David realize he hadn't been truly happy in 8 years. "She's doing well," David said quietly, and Connor's expression shifted from teasing to something that looked almost like sympathy. "You looked her up?" "I saw an article. She's a principal now, has been for a few years, apparently." "Good for her," Connor said, and for once there was no sarcasm in his voice. "Nora was always too good for the rest of us." It was true, and David had known it even when he was too proud and too influenced by his family's poison to admit it. Nora had been the best person he'd ever known, kind without being naive, strong without being hard, passionate about making the world better in ways his mother would never understand or appreciate. "My mother called yesterday," David said, changing the subject because thinking about Nora's goodness made his chest ache with something that felt suspiciously like regret. "She's planning another family dinner. Wants me to bring someone." The eternal optimist, still trying to find you a suitable wife after all these years. Something like that. David took a sip of his whiskey and grimaced. Even the expensive stuff tasted like ash these days. Apparently, the daughter of one of her bridge partners just moved back to the city, recently divorced, excellent pedigree, eager to start a family. Sounds perfect, Connor said dryly. Nothing says romance like excellent pedigree. The sad thing was, David probably would go to dinner with whoever his mother had lined up. He'd done it dozens of times over the years, sat through awkward meals with women who were beautiful and accomplished, and completely wrong for him. Women who reminded him of everything Nora wasn't, cool where she was warm, calculating where she was generous, perfectly acceptable to his family, but utterly incapable of making him feel anything at all. You know what your problem is, Connor said, settling into one of David's ridiculously expensive leather chairs. You're 42 years old and you're still letting your mother pick your girlfriends. It's pathetic. I'm not. You are. You've been dating the same type of woman for 8 years, hoping one of them will somehow magically transform into Nora Franklin, and then you act surprised when they don't measure up. The accuracy of Connor's observation was uncomfortable, mainly because David had been telling himself the same thing for months, years even. Every relationship followed the same pattern: initial attraction, a few months of trying to convince himself this could be serious, followed by the gradual realization that he was trying to force something that would never exist naturally. Maybe I should get a dog, David said, only half joking. Maybe you should call her. The suggestion hung in the air between them like a dangerous proposition. David had thought about it countless times, had even gone so far as to look up the number for Brookside Elementary, but he'd never been able to make himself dial. What would he say? Sorry I destroyed our marriage because I was too weak to stand up to my family's bigotry and too immature to handle disappointment. Sorry I walked away from the best thing that ever happened to me because I thought I deserved something better. Sorry I've spent 8 years realizing that nothing will ever be better than what we had. She's moved on, David said finally. She's happy. She doesn't need me showing up and complicating her life. How do you know she's moved on? Because she's smart. Because she deserves better than someone who gave up on their marriage the moment things got difficult. Because... David stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Because she was Nora, and Nora was strong enough to build a beautiful life without him. Because she'd probably found someone who appreciated her strength instead of being intimidated by it. Someone who loved her unconditionally instead of setting impossible conditions on their relationship. You're an idiot, Connor said matter-of-factly. But you're my idiot, so I'm going to give you some advice. Stop torturing yourself with what-ifs, and either do something about it or let it go. This middle ground you've been living in for 8 years isn't working for anyone. The next morning, David threw himself into work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. He had 3 major projects in development, including a community center in Brooklyn that was supposed to serve as a model for urban renewal. It was exactly the kind of challenge he'd built his reputation on, taking a neglected neighborhood and creating spaces that could transform lives. The community meeting is next week, his project manager, Sandra, said during their morning briefing. Tuesday evening at 7. You'll need to present the preliminary designs and answer questions from residents. The community specifically requested you after seeing your work on the Red Hook Community Center. Which school? Sandra consulted her notes. Brookside Elementary. The principal has been very involved in the planning process, apparently. Very passionate about making sure the center serves the actual needs of the community rather than just looking good on paper. David's blood went cold. Brookside Elementary? Yes. Principal Franklin has been quite influential in getting this project approved. Do you know the area? He knew it. He'd walked past it 100 times during his obsessive drives through his old neighborhood, had seen Nora's name on the school sign, and felt his heart stop every single time. I'll handle the presentation personally, he heard himself say. Are you sure? I know you usually prefer to... I'm sure. That night, David stood in his perfect penthouse and stared at his reflection in the dark windows. In 1 week, he would see Nora again. After 8 years of wondering what if, He would be in the same room as the woman whose love he'd thrown away, like it was something common and replaceable. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Don't forget about dinner Sunday. Catherine Morrison is lovely, David. I really think you two will hit it off." David deleted the message without responding and poured himself another drink. In 1 week, he would face the woman he'd never stopped loving and try to explain why he deserved a second chance he knew he didn't deserve. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating and completely impossible to resist. Just like falling in love with Nora Franklin had been, once upon a time in a different life, when he'd still believed in forever. Chapter 9. Collision Course. Time stopped the moment David Leffel walked into the Brookside Elementary multipurpose room, and Nora Franklin felt her carefully constructed world shift on its axis. She'd been arranging folding chairs for the community meeting, laughing at something 9-year-old Malva had whispered about the overly serious man setting up the projection equipment, when the doors opened and her past walked in, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and carrying the same leather portfolio he'd had when they were married. David looked older, she noticed, with the detached precision that came with shock. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and there were lines around his gray eyes that hadn't been there 8 years ago. But he was still devastatingly handsome, still carried himself with that quiet confidence that had first caught her attention in a storm-soaked bookstore doorway when they were different people living a different life. Their eyes met across the room, and Nora watched something crack open in his expression. Surprise, recognition, and something that looked dangerously like longing. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared at each other across 20 feet and 8 years of separation, while the noise of the community meeting preparation faded into white noise around them. "Mama," Malva's voice cut through the spell, high and curious. "Who's that man? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Nora thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The ghost of everything we used to be." "Just someone I used to know," she managed, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's finish setting up these chairs." But David was already moving toward them, his steps purposeful but hesitant, like he was approaching something fragile that might shatter if he moved too quickly. Nora's hands were shaking as she arranged the last row of chairs, hyper-aware of Malva beside her, of the curious way her daughter was studying the stranger who'd made her mother forget how to breathe. "Nora." David's voice was exactly the same, warm, careful, with that slight rasp that had always made her name sound like a prayer when he said it. "David." She straightened slowly, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I didn't know you were the architect for this project. I didn't know this was your school." He looked around the decorated multi-purpose room, taking in the student artwork covering every wall, the reading corner with its overflowing bookshelves, the sense of warmth and creativity that Nora had fostered throughout the building. "You've done incredible things here." "Thank you." The words felt formal, inadequate, like they were strangers making polite conversation instead of two people who'd once known each other's bodies better than their own. "I saw the preliminary designs. They're beautiful. The community is lucky to have you." They were dancing around each other with careful politeness, both aware of the curious eyes watching them, the way the room's energy had shifted around their unexpected reunion. But Nora couldn't stop cataloging the changes in him, the new confidence in his posture, the expensive watch on his wrist, the way he held himself like someone who'd achieved everything he'd ever wanted. Good for him, she thought, and was surprised to find she meant it. Whatever pain their divorce had caused him, he'd clearly moved past it, had built the successful life he'd always dreamed of. "Mama," Malva said again, tugging on Nora's sleeve with the impatience that came naturally to 9-year-olds who felt they were being ignored. "Aren't you going to introduce me?" Nora's blood turned to ice. This was the moment she dreaded and prepared for, and somehow never really believed would come. David's eyes shifted to Malva for the first time, and Nora watched his expression change from polite interest to something approaching shock, because Malva was unmistakably his daughter. She had his gray eyes, the same unusual shade that caught light like storm clouds shot through with silver. She had his stubborn chin, his way of tilting her head when she was thinking, his architect's mind that saw patterns and structures where other people saw chaos. "This is my daughter, Malva," Nora heard herself say, her voice coming from somewhere very far away. "Malva, this is Mr. Leffel. He's going to design the new community center." "Nice to meet you," Malva said with the polite confidence Nora had taught her, extending her small hand for a proper handshake. "Are you really an architect?" "That's so cool. I love building things. I made an entire city out of blocks last week, and Mama says it looks like real architecture." David shook her hand with the careful gentleness of someone afraid of breaking something precious. But his eyes never left her face. Nora could practically see him doing the math. Malva's age, the timeline of their separation, the impossible but undeniable resemblance. "It's very nice to meet you too, Malva," he said slowly. "How old are you?" 9 3/4, which is practically 10. "Mama says I'm advanced for my age. I'm already reading at a 7th grade level, and I know how to calculate square footage because I helped Mama measure our garden for the spring planting. We're going to grow tomatoes that are mathematically perfect this year." 9 3/4, David repeated, and Nora saw the exact moment when certainty clicked into place behind his eyes. His face went white, then flushed, then settled into an expression of such raw shock that she almost felt sorry for him. "Malva," Nora said quickly, "why don't you go help Mrs. Rodriguez set up the refreshment table? The meeting will start soon, and we want everything to be perfect." "Okay, Mama." Malva bounced off with the easy energy of childhood, completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in the adult world around her. "Nice meeting you, Mr. Leffel. I hope your community center has really good acoustics." David watched her go, his eyes tracking every movement, cataloging every gesture that resembled his own. When he finally turned back to Nora, his face was a map of emotions she couldn't begin to decode. "She's mine," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "She's mine," Nora corrected, her voice sharp with 9 years of protective instinct. "I raised her. I love her. I'm her family." "Nora?" David's voice cracked on her name. "When? How? Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" The words came out harder than she'd intended, but she couldn't help it. 9 years of anger and hurt and fierce protectiveness rose up in her throat. "That the miracle you didn't want to wait for happened just as you were walking away? That the child you decided I couldn't give you was already growing inside me while you were signing divorce papers?" David staggered back as if she'd physically struck him. "But that means she was conceived during our last desperate attempts to save our marriage, while you were already planning your exit strategy, while you were listening to your family's poison about how I was inadequate, while you were deciding that I wasn't worth fighting for." Nora's voice was getting louder, and she forced herself to lower it, aware of the community members filing into the room around them. "She was conceived when we were still trying to love each other, David. When I still believed you were the man who'd promised to love me through every blessing and every heartbreak." "I would have stayed," David said desperately. If you'd known what? That I wasn't actually broken? That I could give you what you wanted after all?" Nora shook her head, her heart breaking all over again for the naive woman she'd been, the one who'd believed love conquered everything. "You didn't leave because I couldn't have children, David. You left because you decided I wasn't worth the risk of disappointment. Well, congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. A life free from the burden of loving someone who might not be able to give you everything you thought you deserved." "That's not," David started, but Nora cut him off. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please," she called to the room, her principal's voice cutting through the chatter with practiced authority. We're about to begin tonight's presentation about the new Brooklyn Community Arts Center. Mr. Leffel from Leffel and Associates will be showing us the preliminary designs and answering your questions. She walked away from him then, moving to the front of the room with the same grace she'd cultivated over 9 years of school assemblies and parent meetings. But inside she was 25 again, falling into the arms of a man who'd made her believe in forever, not knowing that forever had an expiration date that came the moment love required real sacrifice. Behind her, she could hear David fumbling with his presentation materials, probably trying to process the fact that he'd just discovered he had a daughter, a brilliant, beautiful, mathematically minded daughter who didn't know he existed and had been perfectly happy without him. Good, Nora thought fiercely as she watched Malva help arrange cookies on a paper plate, completely absorbed in making everything perfect for their guests. She doesn't need to know that her father was too weak to fight for the family he claimed to want. She's better off believing he left because of his own journey, rather than learning he left because he thought we weren't worth staying for. The meeting was about to begin, and Nora Franklin was about to sit through an hour of watching the man who'd broken her heart present beautiful designs for a building that would serve the community she'd devoted her life to protecting, including the daughter he'd never known existed, and if she had anything to say about it, would never have the chance to disappoint. Chapter 10. The Hardest Kind of Love. 3 weeks after discovering he had a daughter, David Leffel found himself sitting in his car outside Brookside Elementary at 7:30 in the morning, watching through the chain-link fence as Nora and Malva walked hand in hand toward the school entrance, and wondering if this was what rock bottom felt like. He'd been coming here every morning since the community meeting, not to stalk them, but to catch glimpses of the life he'd unknowingly abandoned. Malva was everything he dreamed their child would be, bright, curious, creative, with Nora's warmth and his analytical mind. Watching her skip beside her mother, chattering animatedly about something that made Nora throw back her head and laugh, was both the most beautiful and most devastating thing David had ever witnessed. His daughter, his brilliant, perfect daughter who didn't know he existed. The legal papers in his briefcase felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Custody documents his lawyer had drafted, formal requests for paternity testing, official notifications of his intent to establish parental rights. All the cold, clinical language of family court that would destroy the careful peace Nora had built for herself and Malva. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't serve papers on the woman he'd never stopped loving. Couldn't drag their daughter into a legal battle that would shatter her sense of security. There had to be another way. A path that didn't begin with betrayal and end with more heartbreak. The school bell rang and David watched Nora kiss Malva goodbye at the entrance, smoothing her daughter's hair with the gentle devotion that had once been directed at him. When Nora turned to walk back to her car, her eyes found his through the fence, and for a moment they stared at each other across the parking lot. Then Nora was walking toward him with the determined stride of someone who'd had enough of careful avoidance. David rolled down his window, his heart hammering as she approached. "This has to stop," she said without preamble. "Whatever you think you're doing here, whatever game you're playing—" "I'm not playing anything," David interrupted. "I'm trying to figure out how to be part of my daughter's life without destroying yours. You forfeited that right when you walked away." "I know." The admission came out raw, honest in a way that seemed to surprise them both. "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. I know I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too weak to fight for it. But Nora, she's my daughter too. Biologically, maybe, but she doesn't know you. She doesn't need you. We've built a beautiful life without—" "I can see that," David said quietly. "I can see how incredible she is, how happy you both are, and I'm not here to disrupt that. I'm here to ask if there might be room for one more person to love her." Nora's armor cracked slightly, confusion flickering across her features. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to know her. I want her to know me. Not as a father, not yet. Maybe not ever, if that's what you decide. But as someone who cares about her, someone who could be part of her life in whatever way you'll allow. David, I've spent 9 years being miserable without you," he continued, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. 9 years realizing that walking away was the worst mistake of my life. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a second chance. But I'm asking, begging, for the opportunity to know the miracle we created together. Nora was quiet for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face for something, sincerity maybe, or the man she'd once loved beneath the stranger he'd become. "She asks about you sometimes," she said finally, so quietly he had to strain to hear her. "About her father. I tell her you're a good man who loved us, but had to figure out who you were meant to be. That's more generous than I deserve. It's what she needed to hear, what I needed to believe so I could stop hating you long enough to heal." The honesty in her voice was devastating. David had spent 9 years imagining that Nora had moved on completely, had found someone else to love, had forgotten about their marriage like it was a brief detour on her path to real happiness. He'd never considered that she might have had to actively work to stop hating him. "Can I ask you something?" David said. "If you don't want to answer, I understand, but what? Is there someone else? In your life, I mean. Someone who's been a father figure to Malva." Nora's laugh was bitter. "No, David. There's no one else. There's never been anyone else." "Why not?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, and Nora's expression hardened. "Because apparently I'm stupid enough to still be in love with a man who threw me away the moment I couldn't give him what he wanted. Happy now?" The confession hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric, and impossible to take back. David felt his chest crack open with something that might have been hope if he'd had any right to feel it. "Nora, don't." She stepped back from his car, shaking her head. "Just don't. I shouldn't have said that. It doesn't change anything." "It changes everything." "No, it doesn't. Because love isn't enough, remember. You taught me that. Love doesn't conquer biology or family expectations or the fundamental incompatibility between two people who want different things." "We wanted the same things," David said desperately. "We just got lost along the way." "You got lost. I stayed exactly where I was, loving you and believing in us, right up until the moment you told me I wasn't enough." David closed his eyes, remembering that terrible conversation, the way Nora's face had crumpled when he delivered his ultimatum. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own disappointment, that he'd never really considered how his words would land on the woman who'd already been blaming herself for their struggles. "I was wrong," he said, "about everything. About what mattered. About what we were to each other. About what you meant to me. I was weak and selfish, and I let my family's poison turn me into someone I despise." "David, let me finish. Please." He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I forfeited any claim to your love or trust when I gave up on us. But I'm asking anyway. I'm asking if maybe we could start over. Not as the people we were, but as the people we've become. I'm asking if you'd let me prove that I'm not the coward who walked away anymore." Nora stared at him for a long moment, and David could see the war playing out across her features. Hope battling with hard-won wisdom, love fighting with self-preservation. "I need to think," she said finally, "and I need to talk to Malva. She deserves to know the truth, all of it, and she deserves to have a say in whether she wants to meet you. Of course, whatever she decides, whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Will you? Because this isn't a negotiation, David. If Malva says no, if I decide it's too risky for her emotional well-being, then you walk away. For good this time. No lawyers, no custody battles, no trying to force your way into our lives. I understand. Do you? Because she's not a consolation prize, David. She's not a second chance for you to get parenting right. She's a real person with real feelings who's been perfectly happy without you. If you're going to be part of her life, it has to be because you genuinely want to know her, not because she's some missing piece of your perfect family picture. I want to know her, David said, and meant it completely. I want to know everything about her. Her favorite color, what makes her laugh, what she's afraid of, what she dreams about. I want to know the brilliant little girl you've raised, not the fantasy child I missed. Something in Nora's expression softened, just slightly. She's amazing, David. She's funny and stubborn and ridiculously smart. She builds these incredible structures with blocks and Legos, and she asks questions that would challenge graduate students. She's kind to everyone, even the kids who are mean to her, and she has this laugh. Nora trailed off, smiling despite herself. She has this laugh that makes everyone around her start laughing too. She gets that from you, David said softly. The kindness, the laughter, the way she lights up a room. I could see it from across the parking lot. She gets her stubbornness from you, and her architect's brain, and those eyes that see patterns where other people see chaos. They were quiet for a moment, sharing this small intimacy of discussing their daughter like the co-parents they'd never had the chance to be. I'll talk to her tonight, Nora said finally. I'll tell her the truth about us, about why you left, about why you're here now, and then I'll ask her what she wants. But David? Yes. If we do this, if we try to figure out some kind of arrangement, it can't be about us. Not about fixing what we broke 9 years ago. Just about her. David nodded, though his heart rebelled against the limitation. I understand. No, I don't think you do. Nora's voice was firm but not unkind. I'm not the same woman you married. I've learned to be happy on my own. I've learned that I don't need someone else to validate my worth or complete my family. So if you're hoping that getting to know Malva will somehow lead to getting me back, I'm hoping, David interrupted, that maybe someday when I've proven that I'm not the man who gave up on us, you might consider letting me try to earn a place in your life again, both your lives. But I know that's a long shot. I know I might have to settle for being someone who gets to love Malva from whatever distance you allow. Nora studied his face for a long moment, and David felt like she was reading his soul, weighing his sincerity against 9 years of hard-earned skepticism. One dinner, she said finally. This Saturday, 6 o'clock. At our house, the house you renovated for the family you didn't stick around to meet. If Malva agrees to meet you, if she feels comfortable with you, then maybe we can talk about regular visits. Maybe. Thank you, David breathed, and the gratitude in his voice was so raw it made Nora look away. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you meet her, until you realize what an amazing person you missed 9 years of. Wait until you understand what you threw away and what you're asking to be forgiven for. She turned and walked away then, leaving David sitting in his car with the weight of possibility and terror pressing down on his chest. In 3 days, he would meet his daughter properly. In 3 days, he would begin the long, uncertain process of trying to earn his way back into the life he'd abandoned. But as he drove away from Brookside Elementary that morning, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 9 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a man trying to reclaim his past, but the steady, patient hope of someone finally ready to fight for his future. The hardest kind of love, he was learning, wasn't the love that came easily. It was the love you had to earn back, rebuild from the ground up, prove worthy of every single day. It was the love that required you to become someone better than you'd been before, someone deserving of the second chance you were begging for. Saturday couldn't come soon enough, and David knew that walking through the door of the house he'd built for them would either be the beginning of healing or the final confirmation that some wounds were too deep to ever truly mend. But for the first time in 9 years, he was brave enough to find out which it would be.